You are listening to Poetry, Gossip, and the Pursuit of Pleasure podcast with Dale Byron. That's me. This is a podcast where we explore all the practical, down to earth ways that poetry can be used, can be hitched up to the challenges and problems of our lives, also to the joys. No subject is off limits here. We're just interested in how poetry can be used to help enhance our lives. Now, this week's episode is called The Complexity Trap, Poetry and You. And I know people have used that term, the complexity or complexity trap, in different ways. But let me kind of unpack how I want to talk about that and how I'm using it. Um, we humans have always had challenges, sometimes difficult challenges and problems. And of course, we've noticed, or have you noticed, that many of those problems and challenges have been creatively solved. Amazingly, even, in my own lifetime, I've seen amazing challenges and problems that have been resolved. However, there's also a different kind of challenge, which is a deeper systemic challenge. And I actually think that we have, to use the old expression, kicked many of those challenges or kicked many of those cans, those predicaments down the road. Why? Well, as we're intimating and saying, they are complex, multipolar, lots of facets, nonlinear, and often hurt our heads to think about because they are so complex, which has led us into, in our current lives, into at our current time, has led us into a number of predicaments. And no, it's not your imagination that the stakes are getting higher as we live into these times. I think it's really true and can be empirically shown that the stakes are getting higher and the predicaments are getting more difficult, actually. So my point is that problems have solutions, even difficult problems, but complex predicaments are different. They're filled with such systemic complexity, with both ands, with paradoxes, with conundrums, with the potential for unintended consequences, with what has been called multipolar traps, which is the idea that if everyone acts at the same time, you could solve the challenge, but everyone has to act or it puts at others at disadvantage. This would be the idea of the ocean overfishing in the oceans would be a great example, that if everybody did it at one time, we could begin to let the oceans heal. However, if only one or two players did it, it would disadvantage them in a very severe way. Those are the multipolar traps, and they have perverse incentives, which are, as I've described, the perverse incentive is to continue to degrade an ecosystem or degrade other species in many difficult ways. And they require, as we'll see as we dig into this topic today, they require a web of wise and nuanced responses rather than a mere yes no or linear solution. So the bottom line is this: we've kicked cans, so many cans down the road that they've caught up with us in a kind of series of predicaments, and that we've got to address them now. We have to address them, because if we avoid these mind boggling predicaments, more and more we realize that we're going to impact the biosphere, the very planet we live upon and depend upon, in ways that no one wants to see. We're already doing that. We've already passed certain thresholds, and yet we need to take full stock of thresholds that we've not passed, these complex predicaments. So here's though is the I want to define this complexity trap. It's something like this: If we avoid or ignore complexity, then we know the challenge with that. We will continue to march ourselves right off the cliff, whether we're talking about all these systems that are interacting, political, economic, ecological, sociological, all species extinction, all of these systems that have to be addressed um, with each other in mind. That is the complexity of it. And so if we ignore that, or if we try to treat complex predicaments as if they were linear problems, we know we're in trouble. But on the other hand, what I've noticed is that if we dig too deeply, too fast, with too much intensity and without a break, in other words, into these complex problems, that we get so um, that our hearts grow numb. Our hearts grow cold and numb because it's like there's so much complexity, we just get overwhelmed. So we're talking about how do we thread the needles. And my whole premise in today's podcast is that poetry and poetic language and stories in general, of course, but particularly poetry and poetic language, uh, can help us thread that needle between ignoring complexity on one hand and getting overwhelmed by it on the other, so that we are stunned and numb and not able to even move. That will not help, neither extreme. So let's jump right into the pool, the deep end of the pool, as we say. Let's say that you're feeling this kind of emotional overload. Let's say that the complexity is just getting to you too much, and you're about to get overwhelmed and numb from all of it. Um, and I said my thought was, my note was that overwhelm it starts to stalk us, and we feel its hot breath on our shoulder. So what happens when we're that on that extreme? Well, this is I want to start trying to make my point today with with poetry and poetic language. First is some Rilke, the great German poet Rilke, and this actually is poetic language that comes out of it's a collection of letters called Letters to a Young Poet that he wrote to a young poet. But I think it speaks to this ability to bring us out of the complexity for at least a moment, out of the purely intellectual headspace into our heart, so that when we come back, we can have them both more balanced, so that we can move in a skillful way. Here's what Rilke said. Here's what he said. Letters to a Young Poet. Perhaps all the dragons in our lives, perhaps all the dragons in our lives are princesses who are only waiting to see us act just once with beauty and courage. Perhaps everything that frightens us in its deepest essence, everything that frightens us in its deepest essence, is something helpless that wants our love. Do you feel the kind of permission to kind of step in and reorient, recontextualize some really difficult territory into something, as Rilke is doing, perhaps everything that frightens us? And certainly, if we're looking at all these realms, these complex realms of politics and ecology and society and wealth inequality and all of these areas that are impacting on each other, then we are afraid if we're paying attention. But Rilke says, wonder if what makes us afraid, what frightens us in its deepest essence, is something helpless that wants our love. I was thinking, as I was putting this edition of the podcast together today, I was thinking of the idea Einstein talked about. We will not solve our current, in this case, very difficult predicaments at the same level of thinking that created them. And poems and poetry and poetic language can help us move to that higher level that is not even at the either or level of the challenge, but goes up a notch. And so the predicament begins to look workable. Let's continue with Rilke, the same letters to a young poet. He says it like this. He says, why do you want to shut out of your life any uneasiness, any misery, any depression, since after all, you don't know what work these conditions are doing inside you? Why do you want to persecute yourself with the questions of where all this is coming from and where it is going? Since you know, after all, that you are in the midst of transitions and you wished for nothing so much as to change. If there's anything unhealthy in your reactions, just bear in mind that sickness is the means by which an organism frees itself from what is alien. So one must simply help it to be sick, to have its whole sickness, and to break out with it, since that is the way it gets better. Now, talking about poetic language, a narrative, in this case with poetic language, but I always say a poem is simply a story without the boring parts. So think of this as a narrative, a story that pulls the rug out from under our normal way of seeing things, of seeing difficulties. And maybe if we let, as Rilke says, our heart more fully open and break at the fact that 70% of the species, 70% of the animals, including birds and mammals and fish, 70% have gone away in just the last 40 or 50 years, since 1970, 50 years. If we let that sink into our hearts and let them break, then we begin to set ourselves up to be able to step into the predicaments that we're in, involving climate and oceans and species extinction and habitat and forests and wealth inequality and democracy under pressure and all of the things that we need to be so wise and skillful for. A broken heart first allows us to be open to something wiser, I think. That's what Rilke's saying. Now, to finish up with Rilke, Letters to a Young Poet. And remember, this is sort of a way to step out of the complexity long enough to step back into it to be more skillful. That's sort of the premise today. He says it like this. He says, have patience with everything that remains unsolved in your heart. You imagine waking up in the morning going, today I'm going to have patience with everything that's unsolved in my heart. That's exactly what Rilke's saying. Try to love the questions themselves, like locked rooms and like books written in a foreign language. Do not now look for the answers. What patience! They cannot now be given to you because you could not live them. It is a question of experiencing everything. At present, you need to live the question. Perhaps you will gradually, without ever noticing it, find yourself experiencing the answer some distant day. Well, of course, I feel the heat of immediacy sneaking up on me at this very moment. because of course, with the predicament as it is, we must move with some dispatch. But yet, paradoxically, we can't leave our hearts behind because we will not be wise without our heads and our hearts. We will have no choice, no chance, I'm sorry, to reach that different level of thinking that Einstein so wisely described unless we get our heart involved. Okay, now notice how these lines, these poetic lines, fly wonderfully up underneath the radar screen of our strategic mind. That's the point that I'm making, and right into our heart. So, can that help us invite us into a different context? And I don't mean to move on either in denial or in happy talk. No, but to move on, uh, not to move on in an unearned kind of reality denying, uh, hopeful way. That won't help. But to move on in the sense of having stitched together a hard earned hope that we may claim our agency and that we may walk and talk in a wise way and not be frozen. That's really what we're saying. So that brings us to another poet and another poem. It's called 15 Strokes of Luck by the amazing, talented poet Ellery Akers. And it goes like this. Now, again, remember our context, our premise, I should say, is that we're trying to create a context so that we can deal with complexity and not be numbed by it, to bring our heart along for the ride, in other words. So here's what Ellery Akers said in a poem called 15 Strokes of Luck. 15 Strokes of Luck. The first was that I was no longer in pain. I could sleep. The second was that I was finally able to love. All my life I had been more or less shut. The third, remember these are strokes of luck. The third was that I lived near a pond. Watching the mallards dunk made me laugh. I was happy looking at dragonflies and even their empty exskeletons, their shells shaking a little in the wind. The fourth, the fourth was that sometimes I felt rinsed clean and at peace. The fifth was that sometimes, not often, I knew when I was locked into my story. How many times do we get locked into our story? And a narrative of the world that is not helpful, not even close to being real. Like we can have unlimited growth on a finite planet. How's that for a narrative that if we live into that narrative, which we have been, will cause us difficulty? So the fifth was that sometimes, not often, I knew when I was locked into my story. And to that, I would add locked into a bad story. The sixth, says Ellery Akers, was that I didn't die young, locked into that story. I knew I wasn't the only one who had a violent father. Now, there's a line for you. The seventh, the seventh was that I was interested in pebbles, lichens, and sticks, which were everywhere. The eighth was my group of friends: Barbara, Shirley, Jerry, Judith, Bonnie, Mario, Mija, Eric, Angelique, Angelica. The ninth was writing. The ninth was writing. The 10th, remember strokes of luck? The 10th was that I didn't want to be a torch, but a candle. The 11th was that I could see a stripe of light on an alder trunk and draw it. And even though it might not turn out to be a good drawing, I had noticed it and noticed the forest. The 12th was that I could see a therapist who walked me to the door and said, I hope things are better next week. The 13th was that I lived close enough to the sea to smell it. The 14th was that when he stroked my hair, all the cells on my head lit up with delight, one after another. The 15th was my dreams. They told me to start teaching. They told me to go north. They told me not to drive the next day. They told me who loved me. They were never wrong. Let me say that last stanza. The 15th was my dreams. They told me to start teaching. They told me to go north. They told me to drive the next day. They told me who loved me. They were not wrong. I love this poem. And to go back to that one stanza that was actually quite heart wrenching. I mean, so many of these are heart wrenching, or heart arousing. But the sixth stroke of luck, she says, was that I didn't die young, locked into that story. I knew I wasn't the only one who had a violent father. What is amazing is that we can open ourselves up to even the most difficult things in poems, and we can begin to let our heart break. We can begin to be in sadness. And if you think about the challenges that we're facing in the natural world, it is sad. It is devastating. This is a story that we want to live into and have be different. Poetry helps us get in the right frame. Now, let's change gears, but let's keep talking about poems that help us with this, what we are calling the complexity trap. You know, kind of Goldilocks, being able to deal with complexity so that we can step into wise, well thought, well felt decisions that don't crush us with unintended consequences, on so that we're able to do that, and not go numb with the complexity overwhelming us, and also on the other end not ignore complexity, which which in some ways that is what we've been doing. In some ways even more is ignoring the complexity, and that will send us right off the cliff's edge, of course. Okay, let's go to a Polish poet, amazing, Wisława Szymborska. And what an amazing poet. She just passed not too many years ago, about 10 years ago. This is translated from the Polish by Claire Kavanagh and Stanislaw Berezak. I'm probably butchering that name, but this is the English translation. It's called Miracle Fair, again by Wisława Szymborska. The commonplace miracle, says the first line of the poem, the commonplace miracle that so many common miracles take place. The commonplace miracle that so many common miracles take place. The usual miracles, invisible dogs barking in the dead of night. One of many miracles, a small and airy cloud is able to upstage the massive moon. Several miracles in one. An alder is reflected in the water and is reversed from left to right, and grows from crown to root and never hits bottom, though the water isn't deep. A run-of-the-mill miracle, winds mild to moderate, turning gusty in storms. A miracle in the first place. Cows will be cows. Next but not least, just this cherry orchard from just this cherry pit, excuse me. A miracle minus top hat and tails, fluttering white doves. A miracle. What else can you call it? The sun rose today at 3:14 a.m. and will set tonight at 1 past 8. A miracle that's lost on us. The hand actually has fewer than 6 fingers, but still it's got more than 4. A miracle. Just take a look. The inescapable earth. An extra miracle, extra and ordinary. The unthinkable can be thought. An extra miracle, extra and ordinary. The unthinkable can be thought. What if the unthinkable is that we can rise to a different level of wisdom, a different level of consciousness, and begin to wisely, systematically address with one response at a time the predicament, the conundrum that we face with all these predicament complex challenges that we face. Well, if we step out into this poem for just a few moments, take a little break, then we might be able to step back in to wisdom a little bit more. Wisława Szymborska, this Polish poet, I just recited a poem or just spoke a poem. I like spoke better than recite. I hate that word. Makes us go to sleep. When somebody says, I'm going to recite a poem, we go to sleep. I'm going to speak a poem. I want to perform a poem. I want to sing a poem. All those are better. Anyway, I digress. She was a Polish poet who was awarded the 1996 Nobel Prize for Literature. What an amazing spirit and poet. Look her stuff up. She's got some great poems in addition to that great poem I just read or performed. She died in 2012. So she died about 10 years ago. Now, look, I want to, let's try to bring this whole idea that we're teasing with and trying to tee up here today. The Niels Bohr, the amazing, famous physicist who was right in the middle of so much brilliance and discovery, particularly around quantum physics, he once said, you can recognize a small truth because its opposite is a falsehood. The opposite of a great truth, the opposite of a great truth is another truth. You can recognize a small truth because its opposite is a falsehood. The opposite of a great truth, however, my own word, is another truth. Niels Bohr. Now, that begins to talk to us about the territory that we're in. And the paradoxical territory that we're in, and the way we're going to have to pickle ourselves, the way we're going to have to contextualize ourselves, the way we're going to have to try to call out our heart to join our intellectual prowess, our ideas, our head, so that what we come up with is wise, so that we come up with does not simply create unintended consequences that are going to be worse, maybe, than what we tried to solve, if we do not do it with wisdom. Niels Bohr helps us with that. But there's 3 quotes here in a row that I want to, these are like poems, by the way. Remember, a poem is any language, poem, any words, any language that has us stop and pay attention. To me, that's a poem. So these are poems. Another one by David Bohm, I think. I couldn't actually find this, but I've loved this quote for a long time. I think it's David Bohm, also a physicist. Interesting. I mean, physicists we have who was also David Bohm was also a philosopher, but I think Niels Bohr could be called a philosopher as well. Here's the quote, second one. Every great truth comes dangerously close to making its opposite point. Every great truth comes dangerously close to making its opposite point. Now, to me, this is why when we have a wonderful, amazing conversation that includes the complexity, includes all the paradoxes, all the different factors, looks at the systems and how the systems are interacting with one another, tries to get altitude on the entire scene in such a way as to make wise moves. When we do that, of course, we are going to come close to being drowned in that complexity, just by definition, because we're going to be talking with such nuance that it's going to feel sometimes to our strategic minds as though we're making, as though we're making the opposite point. And so that is why it is so critical that we learn how to integrate heart and head so that our ideas will be more integrated and integral, and so that we'll be able to deal with this mind boggling complexity. The last quote is from a brilliant man, and actually I can call him my friend, Brother David Steindl-Rast. He said, "Every great paradox, every great, every great paradox is not a great truth, but in order to be a great truth, it must be a paradox." So all paradoxes are not great truths, but in order to be a great truth, it must be a paradox. All these quotes, these I'm calling them poems too. They all speak to this idea that it is these paradoxical predicaments that we're in, which have created so many conundrums and difficulties, that in order to approach them wisely, we have to use not the methodology of simple yes no linear problems. That won't work. That will not work. And so we can't ignore the complexity and ignore the paradox and ignore these things by denying them, nor can we allow ourselves to get numbed and overwhelmed by them so that we do not act at all. So I made a note here. It says, "This is why the closer we get to wisdom, aka a great truth, the more nuanced, systemic the conversation must become." That's what I was just saying. We need this approach when looking at complex systems, how they interact, how anything other than a thread the needle response will create deeply damaging unintended consequences. And I know that a thread the needle response on one level scares us because we think, how are we ever going to do that? How are we ever going to do that? That's the linear mind that wants to control everything and wrestle it to the ground. And as we've already said, the mind by itself, the linear mind by itself, without the heart, will not be able to address the complexity. I was thinking also that there are two people, Nate Hagens and Daniel Schmachtenberger, are two people that, by the way, they have amazing, you can find their work and interviews with them, on the internet. Nate Hagens in particular has a podcast called The Great Simplification. Brilliant. They're both brilliant. And Nate and actually has had Daniel on his podcast. So you can go to 2 or 3 times where they've talked together. And my note says and my belief is they're two of the most skilled people I know at the human predicament territory. And they're both very committed in their lives and work to working with skillfully with these predicaments that I've been talking about. Um, and I say both skillfully walk that thread the needle paradoxical line between avoiding and overdosing on complexity, the trap that we're talking about. Um, and and yet I see them both brilliant, both amazing. I see them struggle with trying to step up to this line of complexity and not overwhelm others, their audience, or overwhelm themselves. I hear Nate talk about um, one of the things that he does is go out in nature with his dog and ride his bike. And I can't remember what Daniel says he does, but I wouldn't be surprised if they, if they both have a number of ways that they are drawn. Mine is poetry. I'm suggesting that's certainly a tool that I want to suggest to everyone listening to this that will help us thread that needle between uh, complexity and being torn numb by, and torn into numbness by it, and denial. And so, you know, I think we all struggle with these traps. Even the most brilliant of us struggle with these traps and need these tools, these off ramps, these ways to bring the heart and head back together again, I guess would be the way I'd say it. Because, I've said this a number of times. I said, truth is the strategic mind craves oftentimes a kind of yes no certainty. And so this delving into nuance, paradox, and complexity can feel quite threatening. We must have ways to call out the heart, the parts of us that can tolerate an absence of optimism while remaining hopeful and most important, joyful. Teasing some of those things apart can be very challenging. But I see people struggling with this and going for it. Saying I'm not optimistic, but I'm hopeful, or I feel I'm not optimistic, but I feel joy, and knowing that putting yourself in that context, pickling yourself in that way, is going to have you have the best chance of being able to put one foot in front of another in the wisest way, to be able to have conversations in the wisest way, to be able to hold off on certainty long enough to be wiser. And there's a quote that I saw recently by Ada Limon, the U.S. Poet Laureate, which I thought was wonderful. She says, sometimes in the middle of the day, in the middle of my life, in the middle of the pandemic, I stop what I am working on and blast music so loud the dog wakes up. So loud that I can sing along with it until I have literal tears in my eyes and my throat aches from trying to reach notes I have never and will never reach. This has been my coping skill lately, and I know right now we all need more coping skills. I think we do, especially as we tiptoe into, sneak up on the complexity that we need to move forward with these predicaments. Now, in closing, and I know this episode is going long, I feel it. I want to make a comment, and then I want to end with a poem. And the poem, well, anyway, I'll get to that in just a second. The comment is, we need ways to give ourselves more resilience for jumping into the fray and working directly with ecological anxiety, political strife, a winner take all economy, where wealth inequality is raging, pandemics, inflation, loss, and grief of all flavors. And we need to do that with planned breaks, with mapped off ramps, and first aid tools for reviving heart mind, and spirit. There is a reason. I mentioned Nate Hagens and a minute ago. There's a reason that the most skilled people that I think are in this space talking about the human predicament, they always end with ways that help us catch our breath from the difficult facts, the complex facts that they're often transmitting. And I just want to say that poetry can be one of those things that we use, one of those tools, one of those off ramps, one of those ways to call our heart out to play. Lastly, but not least, there's a poem by Wendell Berry. I've done, I think, probably several times on this podcast, but I'm going to do it again because it fits so well. It's called The Peace of Wild Things by Wendell Berry, an amazing poet, an amazing ecologist, an amazing philosopher. And the byline of this podcast actually came from him. You know, he said, "Be joyful, though you have considered all the facts." That's the point of this whole podcast today, or one of the points. Anyway, the peace of wild things goes like this. When despair for the world grows in me, when despair for the world grows in me, and I wake in the night at the least sound, in fear of what my life and my children's lives may be, I go and lie down where the wood drake rests in his beauty on the water, and the great heron feeds. I come into the peace of wild things who do not tax their lives with forethought of grief. I come into the presence of still water. I come into the presence of still water. And I feel above me the day blind stars waiting with their light. For a time, I rest in the grace of the world and am free. And am free. No matter how challenging these predicaments get, and they are challenges, and they are predicaments, and they are paradoxical, and they are filled with amazing roadblocks to our species, to our happiness, to humanity. There are timeouts to bring the heart and head together. And poetry helps us do that. So we can be more skillful in our actions, more skillful and wise in the steps that we must take. Pause, pickle, and proceed. That's the silly little note I made. Pause. Awareness is curative. Pause when you feel that sense of your heart shutting down, that sense of despair, that sense of being frozen. Pause. Then pickle. Pickle yourself. Use a poem, a story, or whatever you need. Get out on your bike with your dog. Just add the poem, maybe, sometimes, or one of these poems, or something you find. Pickle yourself so that you create a different context, so you make the context bigger, so that you include room for a broken heart and whatever else is there that needs to be included. Like Rilke said, pause, pickle, and finally proceed. Move toward what has meaning and joy, and do it in the wisest way you can. Okay, That is a wrap on this long episode. Um, if you liked it, if you learned something, if you were inspired, give a thumbs up, refer it to others, the podcast, comment with anything poetic that has helped you survive and thrive. Email me, put a comment on YouTube or any of the places where this podcast resides. But mainly, as I always say, take good care of yourself.